Thank you very much for joining us for another installment of The Sages. My name is Benjamin Akakwa, and today I'm going to be engaging a man who is an author, public speaker, sociologist. He's won a number of awards, and since the 1980s, thereabouts, he's been living in South Africa. I'm talking about none other than Professor Kwesi Prah. If you've never heard of him, he is quite a luminary, and today we host him on The Sages. We're pleased to have him on board. Prof, thank you so much for joining us on The Sages. It's a real pleasure to have you. I think you would have to unmute. For some reason, I cannot hear you. Okay, I hear you are unmuted. So, Prof, welcome aboard.
Thank you.
It's good to have you. Where in South Africa are you currently? I'm just curious.
Well, I live in Cape Town. I have lived in Cape Town since I came to South Africa. I came to South Africa in 1992, not 1980.
Oh, okay.
I came to South Africa in 1992. And but I've been all over Africa, I have lived in about 9 countries in Africa.
I see.
I have lived in Uganda, Ghana, Kenya, Sudan, Zambia, Botswana, Lesotho, Namibia, South Africa. About that.
Which was the first, when was the time you got into the first Southern African country? I mean, in the region. Was it in the 80s?
Yes, no, in the 70s.
I see.
I came to Botswana, Zambia in 76. The same year I moved to Botswana. And at 76 to 79, 80, I went briefly to China. And then from China, I went to Cambridge in England.
Okay.
As nothing fellow. And then from Cambridge, I went to the Sudan. And from the Sudan, I went to Lesotho. From Lesotho, I went to Kenya.
Okay.
And from Kenya, I went to Namibia. And from Namibia, I came to South Africa in 1992. After the ANC was unbanned, the PAC was unbanned, the Communist Party was unbanned, Mandela was released, Zulu was released, Mbeki was released. That's when I came here.
I see. That's quite a photographic memory you have, the timelines and where you've been to. Not surprising. But if I asked you, in a nutshell, I have introduced you as an author, public speaker, sociologist, award-winning personality, but who really is Professor Kwesi Prah? If I asked you that question, what would you say?
Oh, really? Well, I'm just somebody who grew up in Accra. I was born in Kumasi, but grew up in Accra. And then went to Achimota School, and then did my 6th form at the Pan Africanist School. And then, from Pan Africanist School, I went to University of Cape Town. And then, from Cape Town, I went to University of Cape Town. And then, from Cape Town, I went to University of Cape Town. And then, from University of Cape Town, I went to University of Cape Town. And then, from University of Cape Town, I went to University of Cape Town. And then, from University of Cape Town, I went to University of Cape Town. And then, from University of Cape Town, I went to University of Cape Town. And then, from University of Cape Town, I went to University of Cape Town. And then, from University of Cape Town, I went to University of Cape Town. And then, from University of Cape Town, I went to University of Cape Town. And then, from University of Cape Town, I went to University of Cape Town. And then, from University of Cape Town, I went to University of Cape Town. And then and then went on to Leiden University in the Netherlands to study. Initially, I thought I was going to study medicine, but I gave it up very quickly and followed my natural inclinations into anthropology and sociology and philosophy. And then did my first degree, second degree in Leiden, and went on to Uganda to do research, came back to Europe, and then started my PhD. And then I got my first teaching assignment in Heidelberg, in Germany. I was living in Amsterdam, but traveling to Germany every fortnight. I did that from about 69 to 72. I had another assignment with the University of Amsterdam. And I left Europe 73. I finished off my PhD. And then 74, I was in Ghana, back to Africa after 12 years. And so in Ghana, I was teaching in the University of Cape Coast. But I had to leave in a hurry because it looked like I was getting into trouble with the authorities of the country at that point in time. So I went south, but I was already connected with the liberation movement in South Africa, Pan African Congress. And I went to their headquarters in Dar es Salaam, but I had already obtained a job at the University of Zambia. And then they suggested that I go to Zambia, to the university, take up my job, and then do some work for them secretly. So I went to do that. And then after a few months, I got another offer from the University of Botswana. And the PAC people said, well, it's even closer to the border. It's right on the border. Gaborone is right on the border of South Africa, literally, almost. So I went there and started work there in the university. Teaching in the university. I became head of department. And then, and then working underground with the PAC, with Pan African Congress of South Africa.
I see.
And ended up with work like gun running, keeping arms from the OEU Liberation Committee and from ZAPU lines in Zimbabwe. We were running the guns and weapons through Francistown in the north of Gaborone, in the north of Botswana, to Gaborone, where I lived. And so we kept all these weapons in my house. And so my cover got broken.
Why did you do this, though?
Why? Well, I have, since the beginning of the 60s, remember I grew up in the Nkrumah years and were very much influenced by Nkrumah's ideas. So I had always been sensitive and aware of the fact that people of my generation needed to throw our weight behind the process of liberation and emancipation of Africa. So it was, I had to do, I had to play my part. I felt, I've always felt that it's necessary for Africans to strive harder to emancipate our people and to uplift our people and, get into the 21st century properly. And so it was almost natural, We were people who were educated on Nkrumah, and Pan-Africanism was in the air, it was all over the place.
Right.
And so it was not too difficult to.
I see that brings back many memories, but let me ask you, I know your perspective is pretty cosmopolitan because you're very well traveled, not just here in Africa, but beyond, the Netherlands, Germany, among others. The concept of internationalism, what does it mean to you, and how do you think we could be tapping into it better in these, geopolitical times, especially in Ghana and on the continent of Africa?
There's a very famous saying by one of the Chinese leaders that internationalism doesn't require you to be running around the globe. Internationalism is an approach to life and to existence which requires that even if you live in a little village, you have attitudes, perspectives which bring you in harmony and in tune to the advancement of humanity as a whole. You see, and that we are all part of humanity. Progress affects us all. What is good for you is good for the next man, or the next society. So internationalism depends on how you position where you are, your country and so on, in the general array of things globally. And respect for our common humanity, our common humanity, what we don't want to be mistreated, we don't mistreat other people. What we want for ourselves, we must expect that other people may also want for themselves, and that sort of thing, these ideas. But I've always been on the left, you see, so.
Now, in terms of...
Internationalism goes with the left, generally.
Right. Now, speaking of this internationalism, one of the places you actually started lecturing from or working from was Juba in Sudan. Interestingly, since last year, that country has been mired in a civil war with two main factions as far as that country's administration is concerned. My question for you, having been in Sudan, which most of our academics haven't, what is your viewpoint on what is happening there? What are your reflections, contextual as well, and the memories that place brings to mind?
Well, remember, I went to Juba from Cambridge, and that was 1982. I was invited there by an old friend a roommate, in fact, Professor Simonsen, and who was already there. Now, I had known about the problems of the Sudan before I went there, because in 1967, 68, when I was doing research in Makerere in Uganda, some of the people I got to know were Sudanese who had fled from Sudan into Uganda. And they were students and so on in the university. They all became later on in life big names. But I was aware of the fact that there was big trouble in the Sudan and that there was a war going on already. And the war had started in August 1955 with what they called the Tuareg Mutiny, when soldiers, it was the closing stages of the British administration. And the people of the South are culturally completely African. And apart from that, they are also mainly Christian. The people of the north of the Sudan at that stage were also almost overwhelmingly Muslim and largely Arabized. A good number of them, especially those groups that were in power and who dominated the state, were Arabized Nubians mainly, and who saw themselves as part of the Arab world. You see, for example, when people talk about independence, freedom, colonial freedom in Africa, immediately they jump to Ghana as a first country. But it's not correct. The Sudan got its independence on the 1st of January 1956. You see, that's a good year, a little more than a year before Ghana. The reason
why do you think that is? I have heard stories about that.
I'll tell you that in a minute. The reason why people do that is that people think the Sudan is an Arab country, you see. But Sudan is not an Arab country. The overwhelming majority of the people of the Sudan are Africans, you see. But they've been Arabized. Some of them have been Arabized to different degrees, Arabized. There are even houses. There's the largest community of concentrated houses that you would find anywhere on the African continent are in the Sudan, in the Blue Nile area. There are houses. Recently they were fighting to create an emirate or a principality in the Sudan. The Sudan is a very interesting place in that respect. So it is the meeting point of the Arab world and the African world.
Mm.
You see, 2/3 of the Arab world, population of the Arab world, 2/3 are in Africa, on the African continent today. And there's a whole history between the two peoples. The Arabs have historically a glorious civilization between the 9th century and the 13th century. They were dominant civilization in the world. See? And so we've got to be aware of this. Now, I went to the Sudan and very soon got involved with the struggle of the people. I was there when John Garang created the SPLM, the Sudan People Liberation Movement. And I worked with them whilst I was teaching in the university, also working underground in intelligence work, monitoring troop movements of the Sudanese army between the East Bank and the West Bank of the Nile, and sending reports to the SPLM, SPLA via Nairobi to Addis Ababa. So the struggle went on for a long time, and from 55 to 72, there was a war going on. 72 got regional autonomy, which was not properly monitored, properly organized, properly run. And it led a decade later, in 82, 83, to the beginnings of the Second Civil War. So I was there when the Second Civil War started in 82, 83. And that's how I got involved with them, also helping them. And
do you think you did the right thing?
Of course, I'm sure I did the right thing. I don't think very sure I did the right thing. It was for the liberation of African people. And there were people who had historically been enslaved by Arabs. Please remember that, you see.
And I posed
history of that, the history of Arab slavery of Africans goes back 1,000 years before the Westerners started.
Right.
You see?
Right.
And whilst I was there, still, there was a degree of enslavement going on. It still goes on, you see. And so I got involved with that. I got involved with that struggle. And I never stopped. I have just finished a book on the Sudan on behalf of the SPLM North. I'll show the book to you.
Okay. So
now, that's the book.
Okay. Sudan in Crisis.
Yes. Yes, I just finished it. Just published it last week. Now, this book was written at the behest of the chairperson of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement North, based in the Nuba Mountains of Sudan, where there is still. So the Sudan is a very pivotal, a very important struggle, ongoing struggle in Africa. What happens to the Sudan will go a long way to defining ultimately where the Arab world ends and where the African world begins.
My follow-up then, let's leave the Sudan and come back to Ghana. For someone who has this worldview and for someone who is touching so poignantly on the liberation of the African, not just the African continent, but the African, you had a pretty curious relationship with Nkrumah, and you lived through that era. Why is that? In fact, you got into some trouble, and you had to leave. Tell us about that experience, that aspect of your life.
Yes. No, that's not altogether very correct. You see, people of my generation, remember I was at school already in the 40s, the late 40s. And I remember very clearly when Nkrumah came back and when he was locked up, by the British, and then finally released after elections, which the CPP won, hands down. And at 3 o'clock every afternoon, we will have a school break. This was Accra Government Boys School, the junior school, which, if you know Accra well, is opposite the old Farisco store.
Yeah.
On what was then called the Station Road. You know, yes, Nkrumah every afternoon at about 3 o'clock would be traveling in his black Opel car from Lagos Town, Accra, Newtown area to the assembly, the National Assembly, they used to call it then. And we would come out at break, 3 o'clock, and we would go and buy peanuts, groundnuts, and roasted plantain on the roadside opposite the school, just at the time that Nkrumah would be driving up, and we would wait until he came past. And we were little kids, you know, no more than about 7, 8, years old. And we knew he meant great things for the country. We all knew, and we all supported him. We didn't know what it was, but Nkrumah was Nkrumah, and we all were in favor of what he was trying to achieve for Ghana. Now, later on, so we spotted him all through, and in fact, when I was at Achimota School, in 1958, late 58, November or December 58, there was the All Africa People's Conference. And we were asked by one of my seniors, Chris Hesse, who became Ghana's ambassador to Russia shortly before he died some years ago, to be ushers at the Accra Community Center where the conference was held. And so I had the opportunity also as a young, strapping youngster, about 14, 15 years old, at Achimota School, who came out to be ushers. About 4, 5, 6 of us did that. So I saw people like Nkrumah and Mumbai and all the big names who came to the conference. And all these things left a marks on your mind and formed us. So, but 2, 3 years later, when I was at Advanced People, we went on an excursion in Kumasi. And we, like youngsters, went out in the evening. And on our way back, it was a time when Nkrumah was being threatened by all sorts of people, because Nkrumah was moving in the direction of progress and rapid emancipation and pushing the border of freedom forward. And people were saying Nkrumah never dies, or sort of thing. We were stopped in the evening, late evening, schools to sixth formers, going to town and going back to Wesley College where we were housed at that stage. And the officer who stopped us interviewed me. Where you come from? What are you doing? I said, oh, well, we just students, and just innocent. We went out and we go back to. Don't worry, we are not dangerous people, and we are not out to kill Nkrumah. When Nkrumah's time comes for him, he will go like everybody else. Then he said, hey, what did you say? Did you say Nkrumah will go? I said, yes. It was an innocent thing, but police officer, wanting to be over diligent, immediately decided that, oh, you're a troublemaker. So decided to take me to the police station.
Mm.
They released all my other friends who were with me. And so I spent the evening in jail. The rest of them, though, it was a morning jail, that because it was around midnight when this happened. But you see, yes, so that was my experience. I got suspended from school for a while, for 2-3 weeks, during which time I had the fortune also of meeting James Baldwin, the African-American writer and so on. But that was when Nkrumah died later years. I was in Amsterdam, and diaspora people in London asked me to come. I was then the Secretary General of GANASU, Ghana National Students Organization, which was the wing of the student movement from Legon, which had in '66 been chased out of power. Then in '66, when there was the coup, the student movement split into two. I was in Europe then, but the student movement split into two. Split into one wing went west into the embrace of the Americans and so on. And they had their headquarters in a place called Utrecht, in the Netherlands. It was then led by Van der Poy and Klutze, and somebody else, I think. But they became part of what they call the COSEC, the Coordinating Secretariat of Universities, something like that. Now, the other wing, the left of the student movement, so it was split into two. One half went west. The other half went east. The left of it was, went east. In '66, they became part of the IUS, the International Union of Students, based in Prague, Czechoslovakia then. And in '69, when I started teaching in Heidelberg, they approached me and they said, look, the chaps in the East, the Ghanaians in the East, approached me and said, please, we would like you to become the leader of this group, our group, of GANASU. So, well, I said yes, and they wanted only leftists, so I said yes, and I was already clearly ideologically on the left. So they made me the Secretary General of GANASU. So in that capacity, I managed to help unite the pro-Nkrumahs. Our man in the US was Kwame Karkari, who was then based in the New York State University, I think, in Binghamton. And we had people in Britain, Kwame Kwesi and Kwatu and others. Britain and people in France and Germany and in Czechoslovakia and Russia.
Mm.
And well, I managed to be instrumental in the unification of these little groups, and were able to take Ganaso back into Ghana immediately after the assassination of Amilcar Cabral.
Okay.
The Soviets suggested that we should have a workshop in Accra, Legon, Accra, and so Ganaso went back to Ghana and joined the home base now and became, I think, nukes or something. But I didn't go to that workshop. I didn't go on account of the fact. I didn't go to the workshop because I was not in agreement with what the Soviets were trying to tell us to do.
Right.
They were insisting that we should invite the ANC and not the PAC. We should invite, for Zimbabwe, we should invite ZAPU and not ZANU, and that sort of thing. So I said to my colleagues, Ghanaians, that look, I cannot support this sort of position, and I don't think it is right for our sponsors, the Soviets, to be instructing us on who to invite in Africa and who not to invite. I'm not in agreement with that.
Right.
So if they go along with it, if they want to go along with it, then I will resign immediately, because I'm not in favor of people from outside telling us who to invite, and it's an African thing. And so I didn't go to that workshop in celebration of Cabral, but it was on account of the fact that I refused to accept the Soviet directive that we should. So that's how I got disentangled with Ganaso. So my relationship, when Nkrumah died, I was invited to come to London to give an oration in praise of Nkrumah, which I did. So my relationship with Nkrumah was like that. It's not either one way or the other. I started as a supporter of Nkrumah, and it was this funny incident in 1961, and then Kumasi, and then, but I have always supported him, always.
That's very interesting to hear.
I've always regarded him in great regard because of all the African leaders that my generation has seen. There is only one other one who displayed the sort of intellectual journey, intellectual steady maturity, steady progress that Nkrumah registered. If you look at Nkrumah's work, if you look at his first book, Towards Colonial Freedom, which is from about 46, 47, and you look at his last book, In Exile, The Revolutionary Handbook, it's a steady journey, philosophically leftwards, with greater clarity, with time. In the beginning, he said he was a non-denominational Christian and a Marxian socialist. In the end, he was no different from people like Ho Chi Minh, ideologically, and Mao Zedong, and he was there. He was in that position also. The only other leader in my generation, in our times, that I've seen who had that intellectual humility and progress was Nyerere, Julius Nyerere, forthright, straightforward, and admitting his mistakes and making progress forward. But Nkrumah was, in that sense, a very senior intellectual. He was a man who was making progress all the time, and he was writing all the time, and he was making good progress. And Nkrumah never took a penny from state coffers, so looted the country or anything like that. People, when he died, people realized the man was just a simple man. So Nkrumah, it's no surprise that Nkrumah, when he, at the turn of the century, at the end of the last century, when the BBC did a survey or voting or whatever they call it, to find out what people thought was the greatest person, African, in the last century. Nkrumah won hands down.
True. While Mandela was still alive.
Yes, while Mandela was still alive. Mandela was still alive. Nkrumah won hands down. Nkrumah. So that's my brief regurgitation of my memories of Nkrumah and its significance. You see, what Nkrumah achieved for Africa, nobody has been able to do that. Nobody has been able to do that.
And that's an interesting point you make. I want us to talk about race relations, but quickly before we go there, since we're talking Nkrumah, and since Ghana is also in the fray, you are in South Africa by choice. I am in Ghana here, maybe across the continent. But when you look at Ghana today in its fourth Republican experiment, just briefly, we've had Rawlings, we've had Kufuor, we've had Atta Mills, we've had Mahama, we've had Akufo-Addo. What picture, briefly, do you see? Are you content with what you see? Ghana is 67. And I don't know how much you follow the politics here and the happenings here and the social issues here and the environmental issues here. But what do you make of where Ghana is today?
Well, I think we are clearly in a mess, in a pickle. By all accounts, life circumstances have become extremely difficult for the overwhelming majority of the populace. Now, it's easy to point fingers at single leaders and so on. Yes, of course they are to blame. So, but I think the problem is larger than just the individual leaders we've had. The problem is the structural problem of neocolonialism, which Nkrumah wrote about in 1965. It's come home to roost. Neocolonialism is such that 54, 55 odd African states are all in degrees of problems. There's nowhere do you see progress. But the foundation of that goes back to the nature of the neocolonial state. Remember, our states, what we call neocolonial, these states we have, are just creations of imperial powers.
Yeah.
They have nothing to do with our history as Africans. Our history goes back thousands and thousands and thousands of years. You see, our consciousness of that history, our affiliation and solidarities with that history should go far beyond what has been created for us by the colonialists. Remember the borders, the first outlines of the borders we have now appeared in 1884, 85. By 1914, most of them have, the Germans were here, Spanish were in Equatorial Guinea, Portuguese were here, French have taken their chunk, South Africa, after the First World War, joined this club. But basically, after the First World War, the borders were changed slightly. The old German imperial holdings were chopped up and divided between Britain and France. With Togo going between French Togoland and British Togoland, and Namibia becomes this, Southwest Africa becoming part of South Africa, sort of colonial relationship with South Africa. Tanganyika was passed on to Britain. Rwanda, Burundi, handed over to Belgians. You see? And then on the eve of the 60s, beginning of the 60s, France divided between 58 and 63, divided the whole of French colonial Africa, or the imperial Africa, into 12 countries overnight. All at their convenience, none with consultation or anything. So for us Africans to treat these colonially bequeathed countries as if they are written in stone is completely wrong. It's completely wrong. And for us not to realize that, in fact, they were created not for our purposes. They were, look, over 40% of the population of the Ivory Coast is Akan speaking. It's about the same proportion as Ghana. How many Ghanaians know that? How many Ghanaians know that?
Of course, there are even the Nzimas as well.
The English-speaking peoples start in Ghana, ethno-linguistically, culturally, that is. They start from Adangbe, all the Gbe-speaking peoples. Adangbe, it goes into Ewe, then it goes to Mina, and Mina in Togo, Ewe in Togo, and then in Benin, you have Fon. They speak Fon there.
Right.
You have Aja, then you have Gon, then you have Mina, and then you have Aja again in Badagry in Nigeria. They are all ethno-linguistically closely related peoples and languages. They have a history which goes far beyond the remotest dreams of French people and British to come into Africa and divide us up. If we do not treat these histories, these so-called pre-colonial histories, as our history, and rehabilitate ourselves into that history, we are not going to make progress. And the problem in Africa, we are not going to, because we are lost people who identify themselves with names imposed on them by others, who think that they just started their existence at the end of the 19th century. No, that's not correct. Right. So we have big problems. Your generation and the generation after that will have to deal with this. If we want to move forward, if we want Africa to move forward, we would have to go to Nkrumah to unite Africa, to unite the African people, unite the African people.
And
that's the only, and if we were united today, we would be a world power. In spite of our backwardness, the technological and educational backwardness, so on, everybody would have to treat us with respect. The humiliation would have to go. But so long as we are expecting the World Bank and the IMF, the Bretton Woods institutions, and the British and the French, and so to help us and lap up their religious practices and lose our languages, we're not going to make any progress.
We're not going to make any progress. And what you postulate has been postulated before, and that unity, the Nkrumahs, the Haile Selassies, maybe even in very recent times, the Muammar Gaddafi's, hate him or love him, have spoken about, but we still remain where we are. But we shall take a bit of a breather here. You're still live on The Sages with me, Benjamin Akakpo, today, and I'm hosting Professor Kwesi Prah. He's Ghanaian, resides in South Africa. He's an author. He's a public speaker. He's a sociologist. Expect more after the break. Welcome back on The Sages with me, Benjamin Akakpo. Today I have joining the conversation Professor Kwesi Prah, and he has been sharing some insightful thoughts about Africa, who we are as Africans, our history, maybe not necessarily chronologically, but thorny aspects of our history that we ought to be paying attention to, of course, as you would expect from a sociologist. But now I'm going to be talking to him next about race relations. And that next point, especially as you've spent quite a bit of your life in the southern part of Africa, not necessarily specifically South Africa, where you are now, the southern belt of South Africa. Race relations. In South Africa proper, xenophobia has been a thing over the last number of years. And then you even have the interactions between Africans, Central Africa, South Africa, West Africa, and the Northern Belt, some of which countries don't even consider themselves African, so to speak. There have been those issues. In terms of race relations, are we getting it right? And if not, where are we getting it wrong?
Well, let me start by saying that the concept of race is not a scientifically profitable concept. There is only one race, the human race. You see. Now, the differences, the biological differences of color, the shape of nose and height, and etc., the physical attributes which are equated with the notion of race are scientifically not tenable, and so one has to be careful with the use of the concept of race.
But is it not our creation? While I agree with you, is it not our creation? Is it not something that we have clung to, whether for the better or for the worse? This whole bit about this race and that race. I don't even want to speak it, but you know exactly what I mean.
Yes, well, that's true. The racialization of humanity and the labeling and so that's all very true. But it rests substantially. Remember, it rests substantially on economic foundations. It becomes a way in which some groups exclude others, and have material benefits on the basis of this construct which they have created. But to go back again to where you started, this question, you see the difference between us and the Arabs. It's not a racial difference, because in the Sudan, for example, you cannot tell the difference between an Arab and an African on the basis of color. You understand? Both Arabs and Africans are black. And the people who are Arabs now are people who were previously not Arabs. They've been Arabized. It's a cultural thing. It's a cultural differences in humanity which matter. Just as you find in Israel, people who are dark-skinned, who are Jews. The Arabs have blacks who are Jews. If you go to Oman, in a place like, you see people who are dark-skinned, who are Arabs. You see. So one has to be careful about the racialization of things. The difference between a Jew and a German is not in color, it's not in hair color or nose size or something like it. No. It's a cultural thing, sitting on economic foundations. That's ultimately what matters. And if you keep talking about it in terms of color and so on, then you are exaggerating. Of course, people of African descent, the African diaspora, have suffered grievously on account of the racialization of the societies that they were taken into, they were sold into. Yeah, that's true. And there, within the order that they have, the social order that they have, they suffered grievously over centuries from the fact that they were used as chattel, as slaves by the dominant groups. But we must be careful about it, not to equate our situation in Africa with the situation we have of the African descendants in the Western world. You must be very careful not to equate with that, because our situations are not the same. Very soon we will have a situation in Africa where a lot of American soldiers and troops and so on will be operating here. And you can be sure that a substantial number of them will be people of African descent. And the interest of America as an imperial power is not the same as our interests. So what are you going to do then? Are you going to say that because they are black, they are your brothers? When Nkrumah was overthrown, the ambassador was an African American in Ghana. Yes. You see?
And
so one has to be careful not to overplay this ideology of what I derisively call blackism.
Mm.
It's meaningless. What we have to fight for is freedom and emancipation and our rights. And much of that work lies in our own hands. You see, our educational system, we have to overhaul it completely. We have to work in our languages. Nobody, no society on earth makes progress on the basis of a borrowed language. For heaven's sake, look around. Italians use Italian, French use French, Germans use German. Icelanders, who used to be a Danish colony, they don't use Danish anymore. They use Icelandic. You see, everybody, Asia, Vietnam was a French colony. They use Vietnamese. Thai, not the Thai. Cambodians, Laotians, Japanese, Koreans, everybody uses except Africa. And we talk about development. We can't develop. We won't make any progress if we work in English and French, for heaven's sake. We can't compete with the English and the French in their language. We can't, as creators, as manufacturers, as inventors, compete with the people who own their language, compete in their language. You can't do that, except if they completely absorb us. And I don't think that there is any straight-thinking African who wants to become something else.
A quick question for you on that, right before we proceed. So how then, and again, I completely agree with you. I've forgotten his name, a professor I interviewed many years ago, Nigerian, he's passed. He was a lecturer in one of these prominent universities in the UK. And he spoke about the same subject. But how then do we ensure that our own languages are given prime of place and still have, because I do not think the use of English and French will go away. Internationally, they have a certain role they play. But how do we bring our African, our local languages to the fore, subsuming these languages that have been borrowed? How can we bring together that marriage successfully? Maybe we can start from education, briefly, from the educational standpoint.
Now, listen, look at the rest of the world. We're not the only people who were colonized and who took the language of a colonizer for time. Look around the world. Don't treat Africans as if we are from the moon. We are a separate species of humanity. Indonesia was it was a Dutch colony. Vietnam was, Korea became a Japanese colony. They used Japanese. They all have reverted in Asia, except in the case of India, which is sort of sitting on the fence. And that's why they're not making as much progress as the Chinese or the other Asian countries. Malaysia got its independence about 5 months after Ghana. Now you can study all the way to university in Bahasa, in their language, which is a variant of what is spoken in Malaysia. What makes you close your mind and your eyes to all of this, all these approaches in other parts of the world? I gave you the example of Iceland. I was invited by the Language Council of Iceland some years ago. And they pointed out to me that, look, we were also a Danish colony, but now 350,000 people, they use their own language, you see. So forget this thing about carrying the colonial language. The Chinese don't study anything in the world in English. If you want to study in English, it's at the tertiary level or somewhere there. But everything else is done in your, and there is no special mix, or it's a straightforward thing. You learn in your own language. We must, if we work.
Professor Prah, I get what you're saying. My point, though, is, and interestingly, it is something that I have spoken of for a long time and espoused. But my question to you is, how do we do it? If in 2024 we said, okay, we want to do it this way. In fact, there have been some discussions even. The Speaker of Parliament here, Alban Bagbin, has spoken about members of Parliament expressing themselves in their local languages. But the point is, if today you decided to bring that to bear in Ghana, we have had a long-standing system of using English. How do we go about it? There's, first of all, going to even be a squabble about which of the languages to use and which one is going to be the Bahasa of Ghana and here and there. How do we do it? It's going to be a step-by-step process. You will not get past the English in one fell swoop. My question is, how do we do it? That's what I'm looking for.
What I was explaining to you, that look at how others did it. Malaysia got its independence 5 months after Ghana. Why are they able to look at the experience of others? Look at how they did it. It's not something which is special for us, that Ghana's solution is going to be unique in this respect.
So in other words, we shouldn't reinvent the wheel. We should learn from example where it has worked.
Yes, all over the world, the whole of Asia has been able to do it. So it's not a big question. You are not asking a question in rocket science.
Right. Let's
look at how other people have done it, and let's get on with it.
Okay.
Let's get on with it, because for as long as we don't do it, we won't make progress. We won't be able to make progress. It's obvious. Look around the world. If the whole of Asia is doing that, even the Arab world, places which were conquered by the British and so on and so on, they've all gone back to Arabic. You see, we are the only people, and it will force us to look at our histories properly. If 40% of the population of Cote d'Ivoire and 40% in Ghana are Akan speakers, then we should have an institution which is able to cater for education at all levels for Akan speakers. It'll make the struggle for African unity more organic. If Ewe is spoken in 1, 2, 3, 4 countries, then it should be possible to have a university which caters for the 4 groups. You see, so suddenly African unity itself takes an organic form, a historical form, a cultural form, which rejects and throws back the colonial experience.
Do you believe this will happen sometime soon? How optimistic are you? These views we are sharing, which we hope for, but look at Nkrumah and the ideas he espoused and how long it's taken. How quickly do you think this can happen?
I don't think it depends on us. It depends on how we do it. It depends on how. Look at the experience of others once again.
Okay.
For some people, it takes no time. For others, it takes a lot of time. For some people, they make a principled acceptance of the need to change, and then they back off again. So it all depends. But first, there has to be the understanding that it is not possible to make progress, to develop our societies, to lift our peoples, to remember our histories in somebody else's language.
Let's now contemplate, and because of the passage of time, I want us to quickly look at some other bits in there. You are known to be a Pan-Africanist at heart. You were deeply embedded in the Pan-African Conference in 2014, organized in South Africa. Where do you see Pan-Africanism today? A la Nkrumah, among others. And there also has been that call for sociologists on the continent to be better embedded in development. Pan-Africanism, development, sociology. How would you react to these?
Yes, Pan-Africanism. Well, yes, I was, in fact, I was the main convener of the 8th Pan-African Congress in Johannesburg, in the University of Witwatersrand. It was held 2014. Well, I think the achievement of the 2014 Congress was mainly that it brought to light, brought to the forefront the fact that Africa has to cater for 2 pan movements. One is Pan-Arabism, and are separate from Africanism, Pan-Africanism. You see, the realization that unity, African unity, is not a continental process or progress. It's a cultural and national process. That's the main fact that we underlined at the meeting. You see that not just we want the unity of the Arabs to be consolidated. You know, they've always wanted to be together and unite and so on. So also we want, so we must realize that this continentalism, so if it was a burial, the 8th Pan-African Congress was a burial of continentalism. This loose thinking of African unity as unity of a continent, of a geography, and not as a people. Remember that it has been a source of great debate already from the foundation of the OAU in 1963, whether they are fighting for the unity of the peoples of Africa, or the unity of African people. Do you see the difference?
Mm.
Whether it's for the unity of Africa, of African people, or the unity of the peoples of Africa, you see. And unfortunately, they spent a lot of time debating that because, you see, not all the people who live on the African continent are Africans.
Yes.
You see, and therefore Pan-Africanism, that's in my estimation, that's the next biggest process, mental, cultural, social process that we have to go through. The realization, the acceptance of the fact that when we talk about African unity, we're talking about people whose cultures are African and not Arabic cultures. That's the first. It will resolve quite a lot of our problems, you see.
I see. I don't know whether there was a quick point you wanted to make in addition. Then we can. I was going to lead you on again to just contemplate, to cap off the conversation. We're looking at an Africa that is ailing, that is weak, that is a sleeping giant, as some would put it. Like you said, if we came together today, would force the rest of the world to respect us. After all, a chunk of the world's natural resources, most of them, human resource, can be found here. We've just not got our act together, and that has created our problems. But what can we learn, for example, from the Chinese revolution, what they have done? How can we emulate from the good standpoints? And what would be your wish for an Africa that taps into that? It may even not be restricted to the Chinese example, but other examples that have worked. You look at Singapore and Lee Kuan Yew and how they did it in a matter of 3 decades. What would be your take on that?
I think it'll come to pass. It'll happen. It'll take some time. It'll take a lot of sweat and tears, a lot of pain. Nothing seriously changes in the world without effort and pain and struggle. And our struggle for unity. The problem is that those of us who have influence and who dominate our states, these neocolonial states, these European-created imperial states, which we've inherited, most of us who are with influence and have power in these states, and by power, I don't just mean president or minister or something like that, but people like me and you are senior journalists, and you ask questions and so on and so forth. Now, most of us are beholden to the colonial heritage. You see, we are colonial creatures, in other words, or neo-colonial creatures. When you said to me that you did modern languages in the university.
That was the name of the department.
Yes, that's what I mean. It's absurd. It is absurd for Africans to be calling French and modern languages, you see. It's a direct borrowing from the master, from the colonial, and that we don't notice it, we don't see it anymore because we are so much creatures created in the image, the cultural image of our former masters. So we don't even ask these questions, they seem to make sense to us. Now, we are the people who are working with neocolonialism. You see, and we are pointing fingers. Where is the fault? We are pointing to other individuals in our ranks, pointing to them and blaming them, when we are all part of it, in fact. The dominant classes, the dominant groups in Africa are people who made concessions to imperialism. You see, one way or the other. From religion to listen to evangelicals from America who pay monies and tell us how we should rule ourselves and where the God is, and et cetera, to reading Shakespeare and Racine in French and de Maupassant and the rest of it. You see, now we are the people who are really protecting the neocolonial state. It's not just the outsiders. It's not just the Europeans who are doing it. We are the people. So when you ask the question, so how do we do it? Look at yourself. Look at me. Look at ourselves properly. And look at the rest of Asia. Look at the people who've gone through it and who've done it. And the answers are easy to find.
Right. Prof, before we go, I have just one teeny-weeny bit of a question for you. You have lived for so long in other parts of the world, but at some point, like the Bible says, 70 years it is appointed unto a man, 80 years if he is strong. You've even crossed that bridge. How would you, when the master calls, how would you like to be remembered? We have 1 minute left. I'd like you to squeeze it into that. How would Kwesi Prah love to be remembered?
Yes, yes. Now, what do you mean by master schools? I don't believe in that sort of stuff. If you have to believe anything, believe in your own.
I am basically saying whatever it is that you believe in as a sovereign God, when he calls you back.
I don't. Unfortunately, I don't have any of those beliefs. I don't have.
I see.
Beliefs at all. But,
okay, so let's take religion out of it. How would you like to be remembered?
Yes. I think I like people to say that, well, it's somebody who was searching for answers for African people.
Okay. That's very interesting. Well, very succinct at the end. It has been thoroughly enjoyable interacting with you, Professor Prah, and I actually look forward to more, maybe on a private level. I will be reaching out on that conversation that I started even before we got into this one. But thank you so much, Professor Kwesi Prah, for joining the conversation on the Sages today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So this has been my interaction with an author, a public speaker, a sociologist, and as you've learned, a Pan-Africanist as well. A man with very deep thoughts on Africa and the African and how we can pick ourselves up from the doldrums. Professor Kwesi Prah has been the sage on the Sages. With me today, Benjamin Akakpo is the name. Thank you for watching.